speakerphone so that we can continue. So really, I'm facing away from the audience here, but I must say I'm very, very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for this 11th annual Pharmaceutical Executive Summit, jointly with Pharmaceutical Executive Magazine and Younger Partners. I think Brent is one of the few people where an introduction is not really required, because I think his career is well known, and he's done some very, very extraordinary things as a CEO of Teva, as a CEO of Bausch and Lomb, and as the CEO of Actavis, which now is Allergan, post the acquisition of Allergan. We're very, very pleased, in fact, to have him speak because on what is an important issue, which is how does one navigate through this rather changing pharmaceutical landscape. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'm going to turn my camera off and then let Brent essentially start his speech. So, and Brent, all you have to do is just tell us when to change slides, okay?
Terrific. Yep. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you all for having me attend the event today, the 11th Annual Pharmaceutical Executive Summit. And I apologize for not being able to join you live and join you for lunch. I'm sitting here in my office in Irvine, California, at the old Allergan headquarters, which is now one of our largest locations in the Allergan network. And we are going to be hosting not only our third quarter earnings from here tomorrow, but also, more importantly, a full day on R&D or our R&D day for the new Allergan. So we're very excited about that here in Irvine tomorrow. So let me turn to the next slide, and we'll jump right into this. And I think, Peter, you'll come back and we'll do a bit of Q&A. I think when you look at healthcare today and the global healthcare market today, there really are a variety of different influences that are driving this segment of our industry, healthcare, to be probably the most dynamic sector of any sector in the global economy. And there of course, many of them are positive factors, and some of them are negative. And certainly when you think about the negative ones, some of them have been highlighted more recently, like cost pressures and pricing of pharmaceuticals. And of course, the challenge that we have always faced in this industry around solving for unmet need and the innovation challenges. But we're also, I think, seeing some very important, promising factors that are impacting global healthcare. For example, the unprecedented advances in bioscience that are leading to bold new treatments for patients. If we could go to the next slide. So as we think about some of the more difficult ones, like cost pressure, they are having a profound impact on our industry, and probably more acute now than ever. And when you look at the broad industry across payers, providers, and retailers and wholesalers, the entire value chain, if you will, you can see that this area, which has gotten a lot of attention, both in the presidential elections as well as by a few bad actors recently, that this pressure in and of itself is causing intense consolidation across the entire healthcare landscape. So, for example, on the payer side, the recent announcements between Aetna and Humana and Anthem and Cigna are really leading to an oligopoly-like environment on the payer side. In fact, we'll be down to just a few large, complex national payers. And then on the other side of the chart, when you look at the recent announced deal between Walgreens and Rite Aid, and more recently as well with CVS buying Target pharmacies, as well, we're really going down to two national retailers on the pharmacy side as well, and that gives puts a lot of pressure in the system around healthcare coverage and formulary coverage and creating data. In the middle, when you think about providers of healthcare, whether it be hospitals or physicians, we've also seen massive consolidation. Now, this consolidation has mainly been at regional levels where hospitals are merging into larger healthcare systems and, of course, acquiring physicians' practices or employing physicians. And in fact, now I believe somewhere close to 65–75% of all physicians in the United States are employed by their health system rather than being in private practice. So we've seen a massive consolidation, whether it be at the physician level, the hospital level, the payer level, or even at the retail level, that is causing, I think, the pharmaceutical industry to have to think about its business model very differently. And so if we turn to the next slide, we can look at how have we been responding to these pressures. And I think the pharmaceutical industry has, in large part, responded to this consolidation and to these pressures by thinking about their business models differently. What we're seeing now is the day of Me Too medicines disappearing, and most of our industries focus most of their investment on breakthrough innovation and novel innovation to solve for true unmet need. We've all have built departments and capabilities in our industry to look at health outcomes data. We have continued to refine our commercial model, recognizing that the role of the sales rep continues to change and have different impact in different parts of the country. And of course, something that we have done here at Allergan as well as look at consolidation amongst ourselves as well. And so if we turn to the next slide, when we think about the environmental challenges that are driving M&A, I think it's fair to say we all know, hopefully in the room today, and anyone involved in this industry, that mergers and acquisitions in the biopharmaceutical space are at an all-time high. And I'm proud to say that we have certainly done our fair share here at Allergan to help drive some of this. But when you think about what's driving the underlying causality of this consolidation in our industry, clearly it's all the things I mentioned on the last slide, but it's also the need for growth, the lot of companies having to deal with the nature of our business being patented products that ultimately expire. I think there's a real drive to focus deep expertise in specific therapeutic areas and have more focus inside of big pharma. And then, of course, there's always this new phenomena, well, not new phenomenon, but one that has certainly changed dramatically, which is activist investors. And certainly they have more funds at their disposal now than at any time in prior history. The good news is, if we could flip to the next slide, is that despite all these challenges, all these pressures, all the changing dynamics, including consolidation, we really are in a fantastic new era of science, and I would call it the era of biology. And when we think about this industry even 10 years ago, it was really more about chemistry. And what I think is leading to a new golden age for our industry is that our understanding of biology is now catching up to our knowledge of chemistry. And as a result, we're seeing many breakthrough treatments. And in fact, at a recent event, I think it was last week, you can see that these products on this slide were recognized as some of the best pharmaceutical products for the year and over this past year. And if you really step back and look at it, it is truly an impressive list that has had a profound impact on many patients around the world. And so I think that's something that we should all look at with great pride and understanding that that's what our industry is about. And when you think about innovation, if we flip to the next slide, it really does have a payback from a business perspective. Put aside the enormous benefit it does for patients. Spending on specialty medicines has increased $54 billion in the last 5 years alone and contribute to about 73% of the overall spend on medicines during that same period. Increased specialty spending was driven by innovation in autoimmune diseases, hepatitis C, and oncology, which accounts for about $35 billion of the increased spending. The biggest driver of the total specialty spending, I think, goes with, to no surprise, about $23.5 billion, was hepatitis C this year. And if you think about what some of these companies and innovators did with hepatitis C, is they took a very difficult to treat disease and essentially created a tolerable cure. And that, I think, is something that we all take great pride at, and certainly recognize that the investment, although expensive for that cure, is saving our healthcare system billions and billions of dollars. And so as we looked at other areas like multiple sclerosis, oncology, and autoimmune disorders, they all were also big drivers over this 5-year period, but will continue to be drivers into the future. And so before I turn to Allergan, I think it's safe to say that while we have lots of headwinds, and we have certainly our fair share of both challenges that we've created as an industry, or that have been created by the environment that we operate in, innovation and the science that is developing around biologics and gene therapy and the like, I think will continue to lead to a golden age of this industry. So turning to the next slide, I thought I'd talk a minute about what we're trying to build at Allergan. And really, we are looking at trying to take this landscape that I just briefly reviewed with all of you and say, how do we best compete given all that we know? And so we've looked at it and said, okay, the way we want to do it and the way we think our employees and colleagues around the world want to participate in this is by being in a dynamic, growth-oriented company. And so we continue to champion opportunities to grow our top line. And the way we do that is by supporting innovation and new products throughout our business. We've also looked at, how do we keep our operating structure simple. We've tried to be very strict around bureaucracy and in managing complexity within our business. And I think we've done a reasonably good job of setting that tone. And now it's up to us to make the right investments in R&D and in our commercial engine to make sure that we can do that. And so if you turn to the next slide, there are really 4 key components to our model. It's having therapeutic area leadership. So in the 7 therapeutic areas that we compete, our goal is to be number 1. In those 7, we are in the top 3 and 5, or top 2 and 5, and top 3 in all 7. And so it is very important to us that we have both depth and scale in each of the therapeutic areas we compete. Second is customer intimacy. We really do spend a lot of time with our customers. I personally spend a lot of time with our customers, whether that be with riding with a sales representative or attending medical meetings or conventions or dinners with KOLs. I would say I spend a significant amount of my time as CEO out with customers, and that's where I get some of my best ideas around innovation and products and our business model. We also are going to be announcing tomorrow our open science model. That is our commitment to innovation by being very balanced on whether it's an internal or externally derived idea. As we say, we have no monopoly on the best thinking, and in fact, we believe that many of the great innovations in our industry come from smaller companies or biotech companies or venture-backed companies or spin-outs of academic medical institutions. And we are here to be their partner of choice, particularly in our 7 therapeutic areas, and make sure that we can develop their drugs, get them approved, and ultimately commercialize them. And that goes to our 4th engine, which is being a development powerhouse. We have over 2,000 R&D colleagues in our development organization who are very committed and very talented at making ideas become drugs. And as I like to say, while we love the science and we love the idea of creating great science, we're not helping a patient unless we actually turn it into an approved drug. And that's what our 2,000 plus colleagues in R&D are so focused at. So on the next slide, there's a good example on how we have historically thought of that customer intimacy in building not only a product, but a pipeline and a product. And that's Botox. And sometimes I think people certainly know Botox for its cosmetic use, And in fact, in many surveys and studies, it is the most widely recognized pharmaceutical product in the world. But it actually sells more, we sell more Botox for therapeutic use than we do for aesthetic use. And so when we look at how this product was developed over time, it was really through listening to our customers, both on the cosmetic side and as well as therapeutically, whether it be in neurologists or urologists or people dealing with spasticity and the like. We have heard from them how they would like to see Botox best used, and we have developed the indications and the FDA studies really with that fine customer intimacy and that continuous feedback loop from our customers. And so I would start to close my remarks by saying, if we can move to the next slide, that this new ecosystem that I've been describing through this presentation is vibrant. As I said, this open science model is something that we really want to position ourselves to best be in to best build our company and build that growth profile that I mentioned, is by accessing this new ecosystem. And when you look at where ideas are coming from and where drugs are ultimately coming from, more so than ever in the past, they are coming from VC-funded companies or startups or academic spinouts. And so we're seeing that money flows with success. And so we're seeing the VCs fund more and more of these startup companies. In fact, funding in this area has increased more than 56% over the last 5 years. The proliferation of startups working on an origination of science is at an all-time high in our industry. And I think biotech companies, both small and medium-sized, have really seen a huge talent influx. And that is good for everybody as we think about these more professionally managed biotech companies that just don't have great scientists, but have drug developers that know what the FDA or other regulatory agencies require to get a drug or an idea or a science turned into something that can actually benefit a patient. And so as we think about this ecosystem on the next slide, the way we tend to think about it is at the bottom of the slide, where, and there is no right or wrong answer here. We just think that our open model is most productive for us, where a traditional pharma model tends to be more of a closed loop system, where most of the ideas are generated internally and most external ideas are evaluated against those internal ideas. We tend to come at it from a much more open position, where all the ideas, whether internal or external, are evaluated on their own. They don't compete for resources. And we really try to create a culture where we don't have a not invented here attitude, and that we keep a very open mind around science in our 7 therapeutic areas, the depth of our expertise in R&D and commercial, to really build the right models and make sure that we can take someone else's idea and bring it to a successful conclusion. But at the end of the day, before I go back to Peter for Q&A, I would say that I think there's no magic to this. The ultimate way to be successful, regardless of the model you have, is to support the right innovation, to love the idea that the way we all win is by bringing drugs to market that help patients. And so at the end of the day, that's our core principle. I think it is of virtually every pharmaceutical company in our industry, and that's ultimately the commitment that we have to be successful. So Peter, perhaps we could go to Q&A.
Brent, thank you very much for that presentation. So for the remaining part of the hour, what we're going to do is split it into 2 things. The Fireside Chat where I'm going to go through some questions. First, a little bit about your personal background and upbringing, which, you know, I knew some, but when I learned a little more, I got very excited, because it reminded me of when I grew up in Hawaii and delivered papers to pay for school, and you mowed lawns, right?
That's right.
But we'll go through a little bit about your personal background, because I think it's important to allow the audience to get to know you a bit. But then we'll wander a little bit into some business issues. But we'll leave at the end time for the audience here to ask you questions. So first of all, Brent, if we go back a bit in time, when you grew up in South Whiteside Township and went to Parkland High School in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which, by the way, they have a hero worship for you over there, right? What was it like growing up in Allentown, which is a very special town, as you know? And in fact, I gather maybe you got a head start in the pharmaceutical industry because your father was a urologist and your mother started and ran a geriatric care agency. So maybe you could talk a little about what it was like growing up in Allentown.
Yeah, so I actually grew up outside of Allentown in a fairly rural area. And in fact, most students in my high school worked in farming or the like. And so it was a really nice perspective growing up around learning about hard work and not really being around a lot of kids in my high school that were college prep. I think the vast majority were VOTech or vocational training students. And, you know, I think it really taught me a lot about the value of hard work. And, you know, I credit my parents for a lot of that. They instilled that value in me. If we wanted anything outside of, you know, our meals and living at home, we had to earn it and pay for it ourselves. There was no allowance in my family or anything like that. And so I think that this created a strong work ethic. I think also, you know, being around a father who was a doctor and a mother who was in geriatric care management, you know, taught me a lot about the healthcare system and how it worked and how important it was to make sure that people were well taken care of.
Now, Brent, I understand that you and your brother started a number of businesses, starting from when you were about 6 or 7 years old. There was a shampoo business, there was a moving company, there was a lawn mowing business that morphed into a snow plowing business that became S&S Landscape, and I guess you had 50 clients and so forth. So, you know, it's interesting because I think a lot of successful people, you can get a sense of what they like when they grew up. So what drove your desire to be so entrepreneurial and run businesses early on?
Yeah, you know, to be fair, I don't know what ultimately drove it. Perhaps it was some of the way my parents raised me, as I mentioned earlier. But you know, my brother and I do have an identical twin brother, and yes, we still look identical. We always look to you know, do things on our own and take care of ourselves. And so if we wanted something, we had to work to get it. And instead of doing traditional work, we always felt we could do better by starting our own business or building something ourselves versus being employed by somebody else. And so that was just part of, you know, our DNA, if you will, and something we both enjoyed doing quite a bit. And to be fair, we probably did more of that than our homework. So we were probably better entrepreneurs than students.
Now, Brent, I'm going to reveal two secrets about you from that era. One was that you had a company car, right, which was a 1975 Chevy station wagon that had 100,000 miles on it. So you had a company car. But the other is that I understand you did your first M&A transaction, and tell me if this is true, by selling S&S Landscaping to someone else, right? So can you comment on those?
Yeah, so I that was my first car and became our business or company car as well as personal car. It was an old 1970 station wagon with the wood paneling and the whole 9 yards. I think we bought it for $900 or something in that order of magnitude, and it served us well. I think we got every dime out of that that station wagon, whether it be going to the movies on Friday night or most of the time packing up our lawn equipment and driving it around to our clients. And yes, when my brother and I both went to college, we had to figure out what to do with this landscaping business that was was very lucrative to us. And we found a professional landscaping company that wanted to buy it. And so we ultimately sold it to them. And that was probably my first M&A deal. Yes.
Well, it's interesting because I do think a lot of people define, if you know a little bit about what they were like growing up, it tells you a lot about what they're going to be like when they become adults and go on in life. Now, from all of that, and it sounds like you had a whole bunch of different experiences growing up and running these businesses, so forth. Were there anything, lessons from that experience that turned out to be particularly useful to you later on in life?
Yeah, I think, I always look for lessons in everything I do. And sometimes, I get the greatest lessons from the mistakes we made. And I think two that I can think of right off the top of my head from that era. One is really being careful in who you choose to work with you or for you. And people really do make businesses work. And so, as we built that S&S landscaping, we had several employees, and sometimes we would try to hire a friend or someone we really liked because we thought that would be fun and exciting, or we wanted to do them a favor, but they always didn't turn out to be the best employees. And so, we started to learn by example or by mistakes that we wanted to hire people who were hardworking and honest and that we could get along with versus just our buddies. The second was the value of customer intimacy. So as we built the landscaping business, we went from initially just cutting lawns to really getting to know our customers and recognizing they wanted us to build flower beds for them or do light landscaping that had a higher profit margin. And, as we got to know our customers, we really developed our capabilities to go beyond just cutting grass and doing more significant landscaping at a higher margin.
Yeah. Well, so you got some of your business practices early on.
Yes, that is true. Yep.
Well, by the way, we have one thing similar in that when I was growing up, I started lots of businesses and delivered papers and so forth, partly out of necessity because we didn't have much money. But my pride and joy was I went to college and there was a restaurant run by a classmate that was losing money. I took over, turned it around, and made it highly profitable. And that fellow to this day still resents me because he became the CFO of Unilever and still resents my telling this story.
Well, he found a better calling, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Well, what he didn't know is that college students like to eat, and if you make cinnamon toast, the cost per slice is very low, and at 25 cents a slice, it's very profitable.
And again, customer intimacy, right? You understood what the kids wanted.
Exactly. Now, it's interesting, at least in my alma mater, the university president had one saying, and he's talking about what do they look for in a good applicant and so forth. And it's very interesting. I won't mention his name, although he became the commissioner of baseball ultimately. He said, the reality is what we look for are people who I'd rather pick someone who has an extraordinary passion for what they do and dedication, and maybe very competent and maybe very smart over someone who's very smart but doesn't really apply themselves. And it strikes me that one thing that's clear as you grew up and in college and so forth is sort of this passion for creating things and so forth and whatever. And so maybe you can comment on one, is that impression true, but also to what extent does that influence the executives that you choose to promote or so forth? Is that a big element of your decision making?
It is actually, and I would agree with the university president. I think when we look at hiring executives, the field is always full of candidates that are smart, right? And so how do you distinguish one really smart, talented individual from another? And I think one of the things I really look for is passion. I look for people who are want to build their business, have a little entrepreneurial spirit, that don't want to work in an environment where they need a lot of hand holding, but want to make things happen and shake things up. And, I call it a bias for action, but we want people who are willing to take appropriate risks, obviously not in compliance or patient safety, but in marketing or in thinking about how to advance a project within the regulations, but willing to put their neck out and stand up for something with passion. That's what I love to see. Whether or not the results then follow certainly are secondary, but you want people who are willing to really champion their ideas and fight for what they believe in.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brent, I'm going to reveal one additional secret that maybe no one in this audience knows, and that is your first official entry into the pharmaceutical industry, which actually, now that I think about it, follows Allergan's business model. And that is, when you were in college, you and your identical brother patented a formula for ingrown toenails, which your grandfather invented and sold as Nail Easy by mail. So I guess that actually officially was your first entry into pharma, right?
It was basically salicylic acid and menthol at the right concentration.
But obviously you had that model, which is you didn't care where it was invented as long as you could sell it, right?
Well, that's right, and it actually worked quite well too.
Now, going now, I think now into less your past, growing up, but also, but really as your, in your career. What's interesting, what I find interesting in looking at your early part of your career was that you didn't, you're a CEO. You've been a CEO now for a long time, but you don't have the traditional background that CEOs have, where they often come from R&D or they come from marketing. And actually, you spent a lot of time on the compliance side, right? I think first with Thomas Jefferson University Health Systems, and later on doing advising companies as part of PricewaterhouseCoopers. Can you talk a little bit about that? But also, what do you think it helped you, how it's helped you as far as your job as CEO of a number of pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, so I kind of fell into compliance back in the 90s in healthcare, when frankly no one had heard of compliance in healthcare. And that was because I was a lawyer at Thomas Jefferson University and Hospital or Health System. And we had an investigation into double billing for resident time by attending physicians. And the CEO of the hospital asked me to manage that investigation. And ultimately, we solved it by agreeing to, at the time, they weren't even called corporate integrity agreements, but coming up with, in conjunction with the OIG or Office of Inspector General, the whole notion of a corporate integrity agreement in return for reduced penalties. And so as a result of that, the CEO came to me and asked me if I would be the first compliance officer for the university and health system. To be fair, I'd never heard of the title compliance officer. There were no other compliance officers that I was aware of in all of healthcare. And in fact, the only ones that I could find that existed were in the defense industry. And, I really had to think about, do I want to be a lawyer or do I want to try something new and take this bold step of trying to become a profession that, frankly, at the time really didn't even exist in compliance. And I chose, obviously, to go that route. It was a big risk from a career perspective, but it was also an opportunity to forge my own way and build that profession, or at least have an impact on building that profession by starting things like the Healthcare Compliance Association and ultimately becoming a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers and consulting a lot on compliance. And so for a large part of my early career, that was what I focused on. And I think in fairness, I did it a lot with both hospitals, managed care companies, and pharmaceutical companies, that it gave me an ability to dig deep into these operations and how to build the internal control environment and the culture of these companies, that it gave me a vast understanding of how the healthcare system worked at a very early age.
Well, certainly compliance has become a big, big issue for the pharma industry, much more so today than it was 20 years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And rightfully so. I mean, I think, part of our image problem as an industry is that we collectively as an industry, stub our toe too many times, and we have too many bad headlines around, billing practices or the like, and we're all the companies have been involved in this. We need to end that cycle, and the best way to do it is fix it ourselves than having a government agency impose a fix for us.
Now, if your first move though into the real corporate world, because before you were at PricewaterhouseCoopers, you were at the Thomas Jefferson University Health System, was really when Fred Hassan, who, by the way, has been a keynote speaker at this event twice. So we've heard him speak about his philosophies and his successes. But he was then the CEO of ScheringPlough, and he chose you to be Senior Vice President and Global Head of Compliance in Business Practices in 2003. So I think that, I gather, was probably your first entry into the corporate side of pharma, right? And how was that transition for you?
Yeah, so that was an interesting situation because I was a partner, a very senior partner at a very young age at Pricewaterhouse, doing very well financially, just had 2 kids. And Fred approached me to join ScheringPlough at roughly a third of my salary that I was making at PwC, and join his management team. And to be fair, I didn't want to. I liked working with Fred quite a bit as a consultant versus an employee, but partnership at PwC is not too shabby, and it's a very secure job. And I enjoyed the people I worked with and the work that I was doing with my clients. So ultimately, what transpired was Fred said to me after a couple of weeks of negotiation, come and help me turn this thing around because ScheringPlough was quite troubled. And if you do a good job, I'll give you a business to run in a couple of years. Now, if you see Fred and you ask him, he will tell you that he never intended that to actually work out. He thought I would come and be the compliance officer for a long time. But over about 2.5, 3 years, we got all of our issues under control. We installed a really first-rate compliance program. We solved most of our big FDA and DOJ and FCPA issues, all the acronyms. And so then he asked me to run a business, and that was really the big transition. But looking back on it, I'm not sure I would advise anybody to do what I did. It was another bold step to leave a very lucrative job with great security to go do something for a fraction of what I was making when I just had 2 kids under the age of 3.
Yeah. Well, by the way, Fred, when he was a keynote speaker, the first time it was when he was CEO of ScheringPlough, and the second time was as a operating partner at Warburg Pincus. And in both cases, he did have the opportunity to mention about the turnaround and so forth, but also about working with you. And I have to say the 2 of you formed a very, very good team because in both cases, they were really turnarounds, right? Bausch and Lomb and ScheringPlough were both turnarounds.
Oh, absolutely. And he was, I think another aspect is, wherever you work, it's always great to have a mentor that's willing to help develop you, but someone you can really learn to and go to. And Fred remains that for me. We still have a very close relationship. I worked hard for him, but on the same time, he really gave back in terms of challenging me and mentoring me throughout my career. And we did a lot of tough things together, but we also did a lot of things that I think created value and were true turnarounds, particularly ScheringPlough and Bausch & Lomb, because those were both very troubled companies.
So now, has it been a dilemma now actually having to run a business that's not a turnaround?
Yeah, actually, it was funny because when I went to Forest, which was the beginning of this journey, the Forest Labs in a couple of years ago, the first thing I declared was it wasn't a turnaround. The company needed to be rejuvenated. I know a lot of employees didn't like that word, but it was not a turnaround. It was a financially strong company where Bausch & Lomb and Schering were both, cash flow negative companies and not financially secure.
Yeah. Well, in the case of Bausch & Lomb, obviously a sale was inevitable because it was owned by private equity, obviously, right?
Yes.
So we know they don't own companies and and keep them for their grandchildren. So that was going to be inevitable. In the case of Forrest, what were the compelling reasons? You really got Forrest back on its feet and so forth. What were the compelling reasons at the time for you to consider a sale versus managing another 5 years or so and growing it?
Yeah. To be fair, I didn't view the deal with activists at the time as a sale of Forrest, even though legally and technically it was a sale. I viewed it more as a merger. And in fact, the activist CEO, Paul Bissaro, always talked about it as a merger. And so when you look at what happened, and I knew this going into it, was that we would put ourselves in a much stronger position by this deal with activists who didn't have a real branded business, didn't have R&D capabilities, didn't have a primary care sales force. So there weren't going to be massive synergies of the most critical parts of the Forrest organization, but rather they would survive and thrive in a combination with activists. And so, I did that deal not knowing necessarily that, or really, frankly, at all, that I was going to be CEO at closing of the deal. But I did it because I thought it was the right thing for our shareholders, but also a way to preserve Forrest key attributes and culture inside a stronger, more viable company.
Let's step back a little bit and look at things from a kind of a macro strategic point of view from the industry. And there'll be speeches later on about the changing business model and so forth in the industry. But we got different companies following very, very different strategies, as you know, both in big pharma, but also in specialty pharmaceuticals, et cetera. What's your view? Do you think that there are a handful of different strategies that are going to be successful, that are going to make sense, or do you have a different view of that?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, I think that the strategy we are deploying is the right one for us, and I feel very strongly about that. But that doesn't mean that it would be true for anybody else. I think the issue that we all have to come to grips with is how do we continue to invest in innovation, which is expensive and risky, and deploy that capital and still provide a return to our shareholders and solve for all these unmet medical needs. And, I think every company is going to have their own view on what's the best way to do that. Is that to invest heavily in discovery science? Is that to invest heavily in development expertise, or both? And, I think the way we think about it, which is limited discovery, and I'm not against discovery, powerhouse development is the best for us. But that's in large part because I didn't have discovery labs. I got to start with a clean piece of paper and design it the way I wanted to, which is a very fortunate exercise. But if you were at a big pharmaceutical company with extensive depth of talent in discovery, perhaps your answer would be different. And I totally understand that.
So a lot of it depends upon the cards you happen to have in your hand and what's the best route from where you are.
I think that's the starting place. And so I think to be fair, we could invest in and go out and buy discovery capabilities, or we could partner to access them. And I think it's the best use of our capital to partner to access discovery capability and then really invest in development capabilities. And, our 2,000 plus employees in our development R&D organization, I think hopefully feel that we're investing in them and in their capabilities to bring drugs to, development candidates into true marketed drugs. And that's an area where I think we can double down or triple down over time in.
Switching to a very kind of a related question is, there's many who say that the role of M&A in pharma is too pronounced and that companies are paying too much and operating in a valuation bubble. There are others who say that M&A has a very important role, but it really varies significantly depending upon the circumstances of the company and the fit with the two companies and so forth. Obviously you've been heavily involved with both. What's your opinion about this question and when M&A makes sense and when other things such as partnering or internal development and so forth are really the right tools?
Yeah, what's interesting is you know, while M&A has certainly been accelerating over the last few years in terms of value or dollars, this industry has always been about consolidation. Look at some of our largest, best-run pharmaceutical companies today, whether it be Novartis or Pfizer or Sanofi or J&J. Um, they all experienced large M&A to create the companies that we know today. And so I think that phenomena is not something that's being invented today. It's just getting perhaps more attention. Maybe that's because of the size of the deal and the value of the dollar versus when those deals were struck, or in large part because of activism and other things that have drawn more attention to some of the deals in our industry. But it's not a new phenomena. This is not something new. In fact, many of our leading, as I mentioned, leading pharmaceutical companies are the results of very large-scale mergers, perhaps 10 years ago, some 15 years ago, but they're all large-scale mergers nonetheless. And then the question is, do they keep on that path, or do they finally say enough's enough, and we're going to now devote all of our resources internally? And many of them have taken different turns, right or left, with respect to that strategy. But that is how this industry has developed over the last 20 plus years.
Yeah, well, certainly there's been a lot of change, and I remember when Merck swore they would, they would develop everything in house. That anyone who actually possibly said something at a meeting saying they ought to license so forth was banished. But look at how that's changed just for that company alone. So I think things clearly have evolved. My last question before I really ask the audience to ask a few questions. One is, I do think that people will look back on this period in the pharma industry and have very positive things to say about development. It's really a renaissance of innovation, whether it's immune-based methods for oncology or stem cells, or you name it. There's tremendous flood of innovation. On the other hand, though, there are tremendous pressures on the industry that are not necessarily positive, whether it's patent protection or pricing, or healthcare system changes and laws and so forth. Would you like to comment, maybe make one or two comments about, as you look out 5 to 10 years from now, what will be the key one or two things that will really have the biggest influence in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which is the advancements in biology, and whether that goes to immuno-oncology or gene therapy or biologic therapy in and of itself, is really, I think, on the cusp of creating the next golden age in our industry of solving for unmet need. And so I think that is probably the most profound part of our industry. That being said, I do think that M&A is around for a while. I've said this many times, but we're in the third or fourth inning of a 9-inning consolidation game. And it's not just because of patents and pressures. It's because the entire industry is consolidating around us, whether it be the payers, the providers, or the like. This is an industry that's still very fragmented, that has many inefficiencies that can be solved for scale. I think those things will continue to put pressure on the companies to look for alternatives to be able to solve for these issues.
Well, certainly if you invent things, it gives you a lot of options, right? Versus the